What you've heard is true. Bumblebee was a good movie. Really good, in fact. Only took 12 years and 6 movies, but we finally have one good live-action Transformers movie. Kinda seems like a lot of unnecessary R&D for something a bunch of guys at Hasbro successfully cracked back in the mid-80s, but whatever, here it is now, and along with being not terrible, it's wildly different from all the other Transformers movies in many important ways, but not entirely different or completely disconnected. As a matter of fact, it's kinda unclear to an almost Schrodinger's cat level of unknowability what Bumblebee is as it relates to the rest of its franchise. Is it a prequel, a reboot, both, neither, some kind of nebulous hybrid, or do we not know because the people in charge of deciding this don't know themselves yet? Let's unpack that a bit. Okay, but first I need to put the film critic and entertainment journal hat on for just a moment so we can all get on the same page vis-a-vis some wonky inside baseball business about movie release scheduling, or else very little of this will make sense. So, movies get released to theaters when they do because they're trying to put them where they think the audience that most wants to see a particular type of thing will be most eager and able to do so. That's why we still have staggered releases for different countries, because not everyone is on vacation at the same time or has different regional traditions, or it's just like cold and they don't want to go out. Now in the United States, that's why big blockbuster movies come out in the spring and summer, because kids and teenagers are on school vacation, and why prestigious movies that they want to win awards come out in late fall, because the awards voting is at the end of the year and the voters tend to be like super old and they don't want them to forget what they saw. That's also why a lot of bad movies come out in the early part of the year or in the weird limbo between the end of summer and fall, because not a lot of people actually go to the movies at those times, but you gotta release something. A weird time though is the post-Thanksgiving to New Year's zone, aka the holidays in December, which is both a huge blockbuster period where tons of people go to the movies because eventually you remember why you moved away from your family in the first place and you gotta do something else with your weekend, but also a dump period where studios will just drop a movie they think might not work, but also might work, but also really might not work. So at least if it gets slaughtered during a busy period, it looks like it's just one loser among several. You see, December's weird because there's typically the one huge movie that everyone goes to see in big family groups that dominates everything else, and all the other movies fight over second, third, fourth, whatever spot, but there's not really a hard and fast rule as to what the one film to rule them all is, the way it works for big action movies in summer, socially conscious costume dramas about dead British royals in the winter. Other than that, for the last several years, it's either usually been a big Disney or Disney-esque cartoon or a Star Wars movie. But when Disney opted to move solo to summer instead, December 2018 opened up wide and became a season of only big, maybe this will work, maybe not gambles with no guaranteed thing in the bunch. See, Aquaman had big trailers and a giant pre-opening box office in China, where for some reason underwater movies are super huge right now, but no one outside hardcore fanboys had ever thought of Aquaman as really more than a joke C-list character, fairly or not, and also his last most recent appearance was in a movie so bad it kind of blew up its own franchise, and also, even without all that, it's a movie about mermaid barbarians and laser sharks, so yeah. Nobody really knew if Mary Poppins still had much appeal outside of Disney boomer nostalgia. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse had a strange, even for superheroes, high-concept premise and boldly bucked the trend of Pixar and or Illumination-style 3D animation for a more bold, experimental style that may have been alienating or off-putting to some, and Bumblebee was a prequel to a widely burned-out franchise whose previous installment had underperformed so badly that it blew up a whole cinematic universe of planned sequels and spin-offs. More on that in a bit. By now, you all know the results, though. Aquaman was an absolutely monster hit for some reason, proving William Goldman's famous Hollywood axiom, nobody knows anything. Mary Poppins Return did decently if not spectacularly. Spider-Verse turned into a solid long-distance performer, and it's racking up piles of year-end awards, which again, nobody knows anything, i.e. Sony clearly had no idea they'd produced like maybe the best Spider-Man movie ever, or they wouldn't have dumped it in December. And Bumblebee is doing pretty good. Definitely not wonderful. Paramount doubtlessly is glad they spent a lot less making it than they usually do on Transformers movies, and they're likewise probably very happy that it turns out China also still really loves the Transformers. But it's not exactly a runaway box office smash, and therefore it's not surprising that the main spin being touted by its studio is look at the amazing reviews we got. Not just as in best reviews ever for a Transformers movie, because everything is better reviewed than the Transformers movies, it actually got good reviews.
I know, kids. I'm scared too.
And like I said, it deserved to. It's a really good movie, Transformers or not. Bumblebee is exceptionally well directed, the characters are a lot of fun, the story is poignant and moving as youth-oriented science fiction goes, the tone is sweet and nostalgically reminiscent of the classic Amblin movies, and yes, not that it's anywhere near the most important thing, but if you are a vintage-era Transformers fan, the setup and side story business with the G1 characters is really something to behold, even if for only a couple minutes.
Decepticons, attack!
No words should have sent a poet.
In any case, the studio seems to be not unhappy with how the release turned out, but there never really was any danger of there not being more Transformers movies, even after The Last Knight underperformed. This is still a hugely profitable multimedia thing for Paramount and Hasbro. The question was always what form they'd take, and that's what makes some of the stranger pieces of Bumblebee kind of fascinating to pick apart and speculate about. Until the studio just starts confirming things and renders this video redundant, but we're not quite there yet. See, it's kind of a timeline issue. Michael Bay was supposed to be done with Transformers franchise after Part 3, but he re-upped for number 4, in part to be involved with the ambitious co-production production arrangement with the booming Chinese film business, and when the new cast, new direction take on the series ended up performing way above expectations, he took on Part 5 as well, and the overseer duties on a planned Transformers cinematic universe with a whole writer's room and long-term strategy, cooking up a big new mythos to build a series of solo character spin-off movies around, the first part of which was planned to be Bumblebee. That's supposedly why Part 5 had a whole scene establishing a weird been on Earth long enough to have fought in World War II backstory for the character.
He was attached to the Devil's Brigade. Helped turn the tide of war, you know.
But then Transformers 5 disappointed, and that whole expanded concept apparently got scrapped, but with Bumblebee already in production by the time they made the final call. And yeah, depending on who you ask, it really does seem like Bumblebee got more or less close to finished as a prequel to the Michael Bay movies, even though the events of the completed film as released contradict the continuity and timeline so dramatically that doesn't really seem to be the case. Yes, the filmmakers are still on record in interviews calling it a prequel and talking about continuity, to which I say, hey, which part of the Wakanda fight in Avengers Infinity War with the Hulk was your favorite part? But as Bumblebee goes, what happened here? Well, again, nobody knows, and depending on who you ask, the movie studios will just outright goddamn lie about things like this. But yeah, right up until the first trailers for Bumblebee started to hit, the untold but generally known story was that Paramount was going to release it as a prequel, let it be the last Michael Bay universe Transformers movie, and then figure out a proper reboot, maybe as part of their broader Hasbro universe plans in a few years. Hell, the first trailer even incorporated the late Bernie Mac's dialogue from the first Bay movie about B.
A driver don't pick the car. Car pick the driver. It's a mystical bond between man and machine.
But then the fans, especially around Comic-Con, got a look at said trailer and gave the film and the revamped tone and character designs a way more positive response than the studio was expecting, and the marketing seemed to change, dropping the Bernie Mac dialogue and all of the references to the other movies entirely, and instead eagerly showing off sequences set on Cybertron featuring cameos from other fan-favorite characters, featuring designs much more in keeping with the G1 toys and animated series, whose appearance hadn't even been mentioned before or hinted at previously. In the finished film, those scenes mainly represent a prologue and epilogue bookending the story and a handful of cutaways from the main action, all of which appear to exist entirely as animation with no live-action elements and don't feature any of the human cast or interactions therewith. But meanwhile, the 4 Transformer characters who appear on Earth in the main story, that would be Bumblebee himself and 3 villains, are all much more similar looking to the way the robots appeared in the previous films, just with cleaner designs, more expressive faces, simpler, more distinct bodies and color schemes, the kind of changes you'd expect when the new director is an animator who's also a fan of the old cartoons. So even though there's no explicit plot reference to the events to come of the Michael Bay films, with the exception of once again calling the Army Unit Sector 7, a blink and you'll miss it reference to John Turturro's Agent Simmons, and the character conceit of B's malfunctioning voice processor getting an origin story of its own, you could very easily chop out the G1 fanservice prologue, epilogue, and cutaways entirely, or swap them with versions that held to the previously established continuity, and the vast majority of Bumblebee would still play more or less perfectly as a proper prequel, even though it does ultimately play like a full-on reboot, and it'd still be a damn good movie. In other words, I feel very much like Bumblebee really did start out as the prequel and first of many spin-offs, then turned into this prequel will be the last one, then we reboot, but then at some point in production morphed into, you know, if we're rebooting anyway and we're already selling this one as being different from the others, why not just cram the margins of this one with retcons, and if it works, now this can be the reboot, and then we can just hit the ground running. I mean, either way, it's not like anyone actually cared about all the leftover Earth is really Unicron, King Arthur and Harriet Tubman were in the Transformer Illuminati bullshit from the last night. Again, highly unknowable, studio PR will always obfuscate and just make shit up, Schrodinger's cat, etc., and even if it did go down exactly that way, it probably would have been more like a series of cascading decisions and not one big pronouncement, though it is interesting that the fan service stuff feels like exactly what I'd have imagined a post-Avengers era Hollywood Transformers reboot would look like, aka heavy tonal similarity to the Cybertron games, and a lineup that's basically the G1 classic roster, but RC is right up front from the start now because it can't just be all guys anymore. In any case, wow, this ran longer than I imagined it would. I would be legitimately fascinated to find out what these decisions really sounded like and at what point in the production they got made, i.e. how far into shooting or even editing Bumblebee were they before they knew they weren't making a prequel anymore. And you know, what happens now? They're obviously going to do more of these, so are they going to keep going and act like this was the new first movie, reboot anyway, and treat this one like a one-off with a few good ideas to reuse? I honestly don't know. For now, I'm just going to enjoy the weird sensation of being vaguely hopeful about Transformers movies and see how long that lasts. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.